Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Navigating an Ancient Faith podcast. Thanks for listening today. My name is David Gwartney, and with me is J.R. Gwartney.
Hey, how you doing? Everything good?
Yeah, doing all right.
Nice and warm in Tampa, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
How's the weather in Tennessee?
We got 60 degrees, and I'm absolutely loving it. Makes me want to, take my shirt off and run around the street if I didn't get arrested.
Nice.
Yeah, super nice up here, which is probably cold for you, I'm guessing.
It was chilly yesterday, but yeah, it was 50s.
Yeah,
and
well, I'm headed down to Florida
this
week, so I'll be glad to get some warm weather.
Yeah, a little bit of break from, Tennessee winters aren't that bad.
No, that's not too bad.
So today we're going to wrap up the Greece series. We've talked several episodes now about our trip to Greece that we took in last October, and we want to put a bow on this series and talk about something that we talked about on the very last night on our trip. And we were sitting in Thessaloniki. I can remember it like it was yesterday.
Yes.
One of the themes on our trip that hopefully you've had a chance to listen to those podcasts about the ascent, but that was a major theme on our trip. When we talk about the ascent, we're talking about rising to a spiritual experience and how in the ancient world they understood that there was so much physical in that. You literally had to climb to ascend. And so we talked about the ascent the whole trip. But on the last night, I think it hit us. We started talking about, okay, what are we going to take home? And then I think it hit us that, we're talking about the descent now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
getting ready for our flight. We're packing everything up literally, and kind of it was kind of fed into that entire idea that we had when we were there about, what goes up must come down, and we're about to head back to real life, right?
Right. If you unless you're a monk in Meteora, I think if you have this spiritual experience, whether it's a trip in Greece like we did, or whether it's I'm thinking a lot of things, summer camp or a church conference, or just a vacation of your own, there's always that point where you have to come back to reality. And I say a monk in Meteora, but maybe you got routine up there for them as well,
I don't know. I mean, I don't see how it could. You know what? I thought about this. You were talking about up in Tennessee here that the weather's not that bad. I remember the first time I came up here for college, and the first time I experienced a real winter with snow and everything like that, and then it went into spring and summer and fall. The falls here are gorgeous because the leaves change colors. And I remember the very first time I experienced it, I was like, it's gorgeous. I love the weather up here. And about the time you get sick of it, it changes. And you know how you go to different places and you're like, the mountains or something, you're like, man, this would never get old. But the truth is, just like everything, it becomes mundane. And I don't think about the weather anymore. I don't think about how the leaves change. It's just, I've been here too long, right? And so if you lived on the mountaintop, I assume that, even in Meteora, you just stop noticing the sunset or something like that. It becomes routine, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. I can see, I think of those monasteries in Meteora with the monks up there, and there probably is a point at which they kind of are looking down going, I wonder what all those people are doing down there.
Yeah, what's the big deal? Right.
Yeah, so anyway, we're going to talk today about this idea of the descent. So we've talked about the ascent. Now we're going to talk about the descent. And when we talk about the descent, what we're really talking about is not just us prepping to come home, but really 2 or 3 ideas at a higher level. What are we meant to take away from an amazing spiritual experience? What are we supposed to bring back with us and share with other people? And are we supposed to change any, or is it just something that we experienced and we kind of, write it down, take some pictures, and then just go home and that's the end of it, which I don't think that's the case. But that's what we're talking about with the descent. When you have a spiritual experience or an amazing moment, what is it that you're supposed to capture and bring home? And, we talked about this. We talked about the futility of trying to take pictures of what we were seeing because it just doesn't capture the experience at all. But it's our lame attempt to try and capture an experience, right?
Yeah, I think that's the first mistake. I don't know that it's a mistake, but it's one of the first mistakes we make is the attempt to try to capture the moment. And we realized this in Egypt when you take a picture of the pyramids. You know, everybody's seen the pyramids. You can Google the pyramids. It's nothing special. But when you're standing at the base of it, man, it is an entire different perspective. And so the immediate thought is to grab your phone and it's like, man, let me take a picture of this, because I'm sure nobody's ever taken this picture, right?
Yeah.
And this will really capture it, and I'll show my friends on my 3-inch screen on my phone, right? and it's just one of those things. It's something impulsive that we do. And so that's kind of what we were talking about as far as the ascent is it a mistake to try to capture it because we know that with pictures you can't capture it? I mean, because you come back and it's just not the same,
Yeah.
And so is it a mistake to try to capture it to begin with, much less take it with you?
Yeah, and that's the question. I think our first reaction is always to say, I want to capture this. And you were talking about, pictures on your phone. And of course, I have, 500 pictures on my phone from the trip, and I go back and look at them. And at some point, in one sense, yeah, it does take me back to that moment. But in another sense, I look at the picture and, that's a very poor representation of what it was like to be, at the pyramids or, on top of the Acropolis or something like that.
Yeah.
Or a sunset. I think of a sunset, when I go to the cabin, there's always a beautiful sunset. And I always take pictures. And what's the point,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and maybe that's it, is that you just said it. It takes you back to that moment.
Yeah, yeah.
But we mistake it by saying that it'll take other people to that moment, and it doesn't even come close.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what we're trying to do when we capture. We're like, I can't wait to show people this. And if you're trying to capture it with the idea that, man, I want to bring this moment back to my own mind, even when I come back home, then there may be some value in that. But so many times we try to capture it to show other people, for the other people to have the experience, and it's like, yeah, it's just not even close. So
Yeah.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
And it actually gets in the way, and that's what we were talking about is how many times is trying to capture the moment actually interfering with the moment itself.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you do that too much?
Because, we talked about that because you can find yourself trying to take a picture of that sunset, or we were in Meteora watching the sunset, and, everyone gets their camera. But it was actually funny on Meteora because everyone had their cameras out. But there was a moment where I think everyone just stopped because it was almost awe.
Yeah, no, that was exactly right. And it's these big boulders and rocks, and people are running around and playing. And the closer the sun got to the horizon, and when it started hitting and it really started dropping, it was like everybody settled down. Everybody stopped playing. It was kind of like everybody stopped. It was silent. There were conversations going on earlier. It sounded, because there were dozens of people up there. But yeah, it was interesting how everybody just kind of instinctively stopped talking, and we all gazed at the same direction. Everybody was looking at the same thing. Everybody was perfectly quiet, even the kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it was kind of this universal understanding of we're seeing something beautiful, and so let's respect that.
And it was kind of a rare moment, too, because, how many times are you in a crowd like that, and everyone's trying to take pictures or record something so they can take it back, post it on social media. I think that's probably the big temptation nowadays. And like you said, you actually miss just that moment of awe that you saw.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
I remember being at a John Mayer concert. This is probably the very beginning of the really social media craze, everyone pulling out their phones, taking pictures. And I remember being at a John Mayer concert, and he started the concert by just saying, after he played the intro song or something like that, he paused and just said, all right, can I just make a request? He goes, everyone just put your phones down. Just put your phones down and let's just listen to music tonight. And I remember that very distinctly because I thought it was such a cool thing to say. Hey, put your phones down. Don't try and record this. Your friends aren't going to want to hear an hour's worth of, a John Mayer concert through your phone. It doesn't capture being at that concert,
Right. And it's just one of those things where that's kind of always been the case. We go to live shows because we want to see it live, but it does seem like it's more of a contemporary thing to pull out a phone and try to capture it. And I guess it's because we're carrying around cameras all the time in our phones and things like that. But it is interesting to see that we pay a lot of money to go hear the music live, but then we turn around and try to capture it on our phone when we've got Spotify. There were studio versions of these songs that are better, that are going to sound better than what you're recording. Why are we trying to capture it? But I actually went to a Mayer concert, and he said the same thing at mine also,
Yeah.
So
same tour.
It's a good idea. Yeah, probably.
Same tour,
I guess
probably.
So. Yeah. It's like, man, yeah, let's be in the moment here. Let's take in this moment. This is why you're here. Let's all do this together. Let's all gaze at this sunset together, so to speak, and enjoy the moment and quit trying to grab it and take it home with you.
And I can imagine an artist up on stage, playing to, well, it's hard to imagine for me, but, playing to a whole room full of people and just looking out and seeing a bunch of phones pointing at you. And you just want to go, put your phones away,
Yeah.
Like, put your phones. So as a contrast to that John Mayer concert, it's funny because my wife and I just went to a Bonnie Raitt concert. The crowd, noticeably older, but
sure.
The concert started and Bonnie's playing, and there was a moment where my wife looked at me and she said, "Look around. Do you notice anything?" And I looked around and I said, "Yeah, nobody has their phones up." And that was probably the over 50, over 60.
They're all
crowd.
our age. That's right.
Yeah, it never even occurred to them to like pull their phone out and start recording. And Bonnie didn't even have to make that announcement, But
that is funny. Well, it is funny how it's just younger people are wired. They instinctively think to pull out their phone, and sometimes that's a good thing. I can't tell you how many times I've thought, man, I wish so and so could see this, and my daughter's with me, and she's like, well, you got a phone, send her FaceTime them, or something like that, and it's like, oh yeah, I guess I could do that.
I can do that.
Yeah, that's right. But they instinctively think that way, whereas it's an extra step for us, and so yeah, I'd say our age group, certainly when it comes to concerts or stuff like that, are better at maybe just enjoying the moment. But if you're younger generation, yeah, there may be that kind of instinct to capture it. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about. The Descent is not trying to capture it, or that actually interferes with the moment. And there are ways that you can come back and relive the moment. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But for the time being, man, the first step, I think, is to not try to hold on to it, not try to take it with you, because it's meant to be experienced fully in the moment, and any attempt to try to hold on to it actually makes the moment more elusive. And we don't realize this in the moment, but it definitely does. Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of maybe the very first thing that we realized is when you have an experience like that, really avoid trying to capture it via, a phone or something else. I guess it's all in a phone now, but
yeah,
but
that's right.
In other words, like don't miss, I guess, that moment of awe. Don't miss the moment of awe because you're trying to capture something that you can't bring back with you anyway, I guess.
Right.
And
well,
there's
awe is focused attention.
Yeah,
and
that's
anything that you've had a conversation with somebody where they pulled their phone out and hold on real quick, just let me send this text out, and it breaks the conversation. It kind of just takes away from it a little bit, and us doing that in the moment actually has that same effect. So awe is focused attention, and anything that we do to try to capture that actually breaks that focus.
Yeah, well said. Well, one of the Bible stories, I guess, that I thought of when we were talking about this. And, again, we were sitting in Thessaloniki in our hotel room. We had just had some coffees and pastries, and we were about to walk on the waterfront. And as we were talking about some of these very ideas, one of the stories from the Bible that came to mind was the Transfiguration. And so we started talking about that, how the Transfiguration, well, do you have it up?
Yes, Matthew 17.
Yeah.
Yeah, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. They went up on a high mountain by themselves, and there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Then there appeared Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. And this is what you were talking about. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, is it good for us to be here? If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah."
Yeah. So I thought about that verse that you just read there, Matthew 17:4. And, I wonder if that was the ancient version of how do I capture this moment, So
yeah.
we have the
phone out.
Yeah, so we have the Transfiguration, Jesus is there, and then Next to him appears Moses and Elijah. And, what is poor Peter? We always pick on Peter, but, Peter's the one who blurts out, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters. Let's try and capture this moment. And I was laughing about that because I really do think maybe that was the ancient version of, taking out your iPhone. Hold on, guys. Let me try and video this.
Yeah. Y'all get closer together. Get in the frame. Yeah. That's that type thing. You're right.
Wait to how many likes am I going to get when I post this video?
Right.
So, but it is interesting that Peter's reaction was, how do we keep this moment going? How do we just stay here? And I think you and I had talked about before that when he says, I will put up 3 shelters, there's actually a lot of meaning in that idea of putting up a shelter, because I think in our minds, we think he just wanted to like throw a tent up or something, a couple of camping chairs. And we're like, well, what's that about? That's weird. But actually what it was is when people would assemble, when different tribes and leaders would assemble, especially in a nomadic culture like out in the desert, they would put up tents. And the tents symbolize that we're about to have a meeting. We're about to assemble, right?
Right.
And so when you kind of understand that backdrop of it, it makes a little more sense. And the positioning of the tents, would be very important. The most important person would have the big tent right in the middle. And whoever was on the tent, on one side and the other, that kind of gave everyone their rank and order there. So actually what Peter's doing kind of makes sense. Hey, if we're going to have a big assembly here, why don't we start putting up shelters so we can, this is going to be a several day thing. And of course, Jesus's response is, actually, I'm looking at I'm reading through this right now, and Jesus doesn't really even acknowledge him. He probably just rolled his eyes. But
he just ignores him. Yeah, moves on.
But the whole idea is like he doesn't even really acknowledge the comment, because the idea is that like, no, Peter, we're not going to do that. And then he's transfigured and they disappear and the moment's gone. But can you imagine if like Peter's off getting wood for shelters and they disappear and
yeah. And he missed out on it, right? Because he was trying to prepare to hold it. That's right.
So I thought there was an interesting story around this, idea of trying to capture a moment. It's not a new thing. It goes all the way, back to the very beginning. Somehow, someone had in a cave, hold on, let me try and chisel this into stone,
Yeah. Well, and when we went to Jerusalem, it was like this. It was kind of a little bit different. I didn't realize that, when we're going to the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion or the tomb, you're not going into a cave and you're not the cross, you're not seeing a hole in the ground where the cross was. It's just a tabernacle. It's a church now. And so you walk inside this gorgeous cathedral and they're like, yeah, here's the traditional site right here in this corner. And it's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And so there is kind of a tendency, an instinct to want to memorialize, commemorate a site or a situation by building a shelter, or maybe a tabernacle is a better word, so that we can come revisit this place. And I think that's what Jesus's non-response to Peter might have been saying. No, just be here in the moment. There'll be a time later if you want to come back and stack some rocks, that's fine. But right now, be here right now.
Yeah. And that was a pretty common thing throughout the Bible is, actually memorializing something by piling rocks. They did that in the Old Testament. And, we've done things to memorialize places, but that's a little bit different than saying, I want to capture this moment, what's happening right now,
Right.
Because you don't start building rocks in the moment. Because like you said, I like that idea of awe as focused attention of, you can't be in awe if you're out gathering rocks, right? To memorialize something.
Yeah, that's right.
You're going to miss the awe.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Well, so we've kind of talked about what not to do, but then, you and I started talking about, so what are we supposed to take back with us?
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to figure out is how much of it do you try to capture in the moment? And we kind of covered that about, well, first of all, be in the moment, but then how do we relive that? Because, we are supposed to come down, we are supposed to descend, but we're not supposed to descend the same way. We're not coming back the same people we were before we ascended, right?
Right.
And so we want to know what do we bring back? If we're not supposed to capture the moment, what are we supposed to bring back? And well, we talked about several things just earlier in the conversations. I do think that the taking a quick picture or something like that can does take me back. I look through my phone all the time about our trip, and it does take us back. One thing that I thought was funny is we unwittingly created a grunge, a playlist on Spotify. We put together this thing because we were listening to this, I don't know, we were in a grunge mood. So we're listening to 90s grunge music and Nirvana and Foo Fighters and all this kind of stuff. And we put together a playlist. And it's funny that when I listen to those songs, there are certain songs that I can tell you exactly where I was at in Greece when you or I were listening to them. You know, it's so weird that my mind does that. But I think that's an interesting thing, that we can actually go back. You can actually take it. You can actually go back to that moment if you connect it with music or something like that. And I'm assuming that's why music is so instrumental in religious experience anyway. But a little bit disconnected idea. But as far as the grunge music, but it is interesting that it pulls you back. And so there are things that we can do in the moment that we can take that with us, so to speak. But also we kind of you're right. We have to learn how to descend and how to come back to normal life. I think I made the comment at one point that it's great to fall in love, but if you got hearts in your eyes all the time and things like that for your significant other, then that'll trump going to work. That'll trump eating and sleeping sometimes, right? You have to come off of that high to actually live life together and move forward. So yeah, how do we come down, and what do we bring with us?
Yeah.
And how do you make that change moving forward?
Well, so it's interesting because I think one of the conclusions I reached is, so we're not trying to capture that moment, but what we can bring back with us are rituals. And I heard someone else say this recently, like, you can ritualize something, and that's a way to bring some of the experience back to share with others. So you're not saying, hey, here's exactly what we experienced, but here's a little ritual. And it's funny because, the 90s grunge playlist has a total ritual, and we can list several of those. So here's a funny one, because I just thought of this the other day, is another music-related ritual that we brought back, or at least I did, was there's a Spotify channel that is a jazz channel of 80s and 90s songs. And so the other day I wanted something just relaxing to listen to, and I was like, yes, the 80s and 90s jazz versions of rock songs. And if you haven't heard a jazz version of, say, like Metallica or Smells Like Teen Spirit, like,
Enter Sandman,
you're missing something, right?
Yeah. But that was playing, and we didn't find that. It was just what we noticed at several different hotels and several different restaurants. We were like, it's like, I've heard this song before, or I recognized the lyrics, but I'd never heard the song. And then we figured out, it's like, man, they love these jazz covers of 80s and 90s.
It became a game. It became a game, like, okay, next song, like, who's the first to recognize what song is actually playing, because it's this nice smooth jazz sound going on, and then you realize it's like Metallica Enter Sandman or something like that.
No, you're right, that can be a ritual, and it takes you back. That's exactly right.
So rituals, and we talked about cappuccino freddos. We talked about that previously as well. Like, so there are little rituals that you can bring back with you that help take you back to those moments. And I'm sure if we thought hard enough, I could think of rituals that I brought back from other trips,
Yeah. Okay. So here's a question: can you look at rituals? Is it? Can you back engineer that? Does that make sense? And we kind of talked about it with the pictures, where I can look at my pictures of the pyramids, and it takes me back there, but I can't show that picture to somebody else,
right?
And it really capture it. Well, rituals are the same way. So there are rituals that we come across in different religious services and things like that. Can those be back engineered to take you to a certain spot, or are those rituals usually designed to take the person who's already been to a particular place back?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the things we were talking about, like, I'm not going to play a grunge list, to a friend of mine and go, "Hey, don't you
Right,
feel like you're in
right.
Greece?" Like they just
yeah, exactly.
they just look at me. But the larger idea of ritual, I'd have to think about, because the larger idea of ritual, I think, is this idea that you are helping people collectively remember something in a very ritualized manner that they didn't really experience themselves. I mean, when you talk about like religious ritual, church ritual, that's really what it is, that we're collectively trying to remember this.
Right. What do I tell my descendants when you put the stones together for future generations to look back, and they say build a marker so that when future generations ask, you can tell them. So you're saying that ties into ritual, or that can become a component of ritual, so that other generations that didn't experience whatever, the Red Sea crossing or whatever it is, that they could be a part of that. Right.
Well, I think of, say, the Eucharist, right? Like, none of us were there at the Last Supper, and yet we've ritualized it because, we've been taught its meaning. We read about its meaning in the Bible, and so now every time, we engage in the Eucharist, we're actually engaging in the ritual that goes back to the Lord's Supper, but none of us were there.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So that would be an example of something that's been, ritualized.
Okay. So part of the descent is to create, or perhaps part of the descent is to create a ritual.
Yeah, I think, and gosh, it's not obvious what those might be, but I do think I can think back at times where I've created a ritual from, say, a retreat I had at a cabin, and if I were maybe teaching other people, leading a small group or something, there might be ways to start to pull that ritual in, and I could say something like, hey, at the cabin, I always did this, and I want to kind of introduce this ritual to this group, and we can participate in it together. And then, I think it's a matter of like, that could become meaningful for people. So I think that's kind of maybe not a great way of really getting into it, but I'm still kind of processing it. But we can definitely bring back rituals for ourselves. And I think with a little thought, or the rituals, maybe the better way to say it is the rituals that have really wider meaning, that other people will automatically or over time start to gravitate to those rituals and participate in something maybe that they weren't involved in initially. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I like the idea that it calls you back. Obviously we weren't at the Last Supper, but at the same time, we can be called back to a moment where the Last Supper was perhaps powerful and meaningful to us. I think there's another tendency, especially in religion in general, Western religion particularly, that when you come up with a really neat idea, and I think about this, you'll know where I'm going with this in the church, that you come up with a neat idea, something that makes a profound impact, there's a tendency to want to package that and make a book out of it and make I'll show my age, make a DVD set out of it and a 5-week Bible study, and hope that it catches, and then spread it to every church you can possibly, because I think that's an attempt at ritualization, but it's missing. It's missing something, and I think what it's missing is you're trying to generate the experience from the ground, from the ritual, without having had the initial experience to begin with, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely easy to try and manufacture an experience for people rather than just ritualizing.
Yeah. No, that's a good word. A manufactured experience. Yeah. Yes, there's a lot of that that we see, and that's not what we're talking about. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so that's probably the second thing is, what can I ritualize? And maybe what can I ritualize that might be meaningful to other people without trying to manufacture an experience, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it.
Well, another thing that we had talked about that I think we have a tendency to do, especially if you, I think actually you mentioned this idea of, as a kid going away to summer camp.
Oh,
and
yeah.
having an amazing week and thinking, man, my life's really going to change. And, a week later, you've completely forgotten about it.
Sure.
So
yeah.
when we have a meaningful spiritual experience, when we have an ascent type of moment, I think there's a tendency to kind of overestimate the immediate impact and underestimate the small incremental changes that can happen from something like that.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, because you want to take the emotion with you, and emotions. I mean, we know how it is. Sometimes you have good days and bad days, and all it takes is a rough day to blast away the emotional experience that you might have had the week before, the night before, whatever. And so yes, so we try to carry the emotions, but what we're talking about in the descent is how do we? I like that word, ritualize. I'll put that to the side for a little bit. But how do we make those incremental changes that do embody the original religious experience?
Yeah, I've learned over time taking these trips, and I keep saying that I take a yearly retreat to a cabin, and I can definitely think of those times that it's changed me. But again, it's been in small ways. So it's not to say I'm going to come home and everything's going to be different, because I come home and, still have bills to pay. And, my wife probably has a lot of stuff for me to do around the house. And so you kind of hit reality pretty quickly upon reentry.
Sure.
I think in any experience like that. But, what are the small incremental changes? I can think back to some of the things that I've done. I remember one retreat specifically where I read a couple books and I wanted to read more. And so in that way, it just changed what I read really honestly for the next several years,
Yeah.
So,
well, finish that thought.
Well, so that I just said that's one thing. And so I've tried to temper how much is going to change, but also I've tried to be intentional about, okay, what are 2 or 3 things that I can take back, even if it's just what I read. I'm trying to think of other examples.
Well, when we came back from Delphi, we both read a book called The Oracle, and it was interesting because we had that conversation. It's like, man, I wish we would have read this before we went to Delphi. And then we continued the conversation, and we were like, no, I'm actually glad that we read it afterward.
Yeah.
Because it kind of solidified what we saw. Because we had a context for the entire book. If I had read it before, there would have just been too many disjointed ideas that I wouldn't have been able to wrap my head around. But once we had been there and we'd been to the site, then we read about the Oracle, the ancient Oracle. It kind of was another layer on top of that really helped deepen the experience of being there. And so I thought about, it was interesting. It was like going back when I read that book.
Yeah.
So many parts of it. So what you read, returning from it, and we're talking about obviously a particular place, and we're trying to kind of overlay that with the idea of a religious experience. But yeah, what you read and what you follow up with does help it does show through in different light, and you hold on to it in a different way.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think you're right. What you read matters afterward, helps hold on to it.
So there's other small incremental changes, but I think the other point that I've learned is that those small incremental changes need to be directed exactly to that ordinary routine of life, right? Because that's where 95% of our life is lived,
Right. Sure.
And so it doesn't do any good to go, man, I can't wait for the next trip and just go back to normal. But it's what can I change, whether it's what I read, whether it's, maybe it's a spiritual practice that you experience for the first time and you want to bring more into that. Maybe it's just a different perspective on some of your relationships. These are just kind of the things that I think through when I come back from a particularly meaningful moment. But I do think it is supposed to, in very small ways, affect just that day-to-day routine. It's not supposed to be the same, and I think we miss the point of that if we do just go back and engage the very same way that we've always done it, you know?
Well, and my family they get a kick out of me coming back from these trips because they're like, oh, he doesn't shut up about it. And they can be talking about whatever salad dressing, and I'm gonna tie it into, oh man, you should have seen the salad dressing over there. Should have seen the salad dressing in Greek or something like that. So everything, it is funny because everything ties back to the trip or the experience, and we can do the same thing, with religious experiences. That is how you come back changed, and it doesn't mean you incessantly insist on turning every conversation to whatever your experience it is. But you do find that so many conversations you have will draw you back to this experience. And when you join a community, and it can be just a single conversation with one other person, or it can be the broader community, when you engage that to the community, that actually makes the experience more tangible in your day-to-day life as well. And sometimes just reliving the experience, using it to inform other people about the experience. It gives you a chance to kind of talk it out and things like that. And that really makes it more of a day-to-day, how to relive that and how to bring that with you. Because if something changes you, well, what good does the change do if it doesn't reflect in your day-to-day life anyway?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you want to come back with some kind of change. And so if it's a genuine experience, it's going to work its way into the cracks of your life, the day-to-day interactions that you have. And we all know that these things wear off. The camp high does die down. But at the same time, that's the emotion. But the practical part of it that we can share with other people, that really does stick with you. And sometimes when you try to, let's say, write it all down and try to take it with you in a concrete way, maybe that's also a way that we're missing. Well, you'll just overlook all the opportunities that you're going to have, when you come back to relive that and bring that to other people.
Yeah.
That it happens more than you think.
Yeah. And, I've had experiences where, nothing changed because I just was oblivious to the whole thing. But I've also had other experiences where you get some feedback where I remember one time in particular, someone actually just said to me, they're like, "You're different since you came back." And I thought, oh, wow, it's that noticeable,
Yeah, what a compliment.
Yeah. So one of the things I really try to do is when I have those ascent type of experiences is to, and maybe it takes maybe it's all in the rearview mirror, but I want to be able to look back and go, yeah, things subtly changed since that experience. And if it didn't, then, I kind of wondered what I missed,
Yeah, or question the experience.
Yeah,
maybe it's not as profound as I thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah, if it didn't change anything, then, maybe it was just a John Mayer concert. I don't know.
Yeah.
Although that's not a dig against John Mayer concert. That was a great concert. But
no. Well, it is something like, I think more on the lines of something surface, like a video game. I could get into a video game and love it, and I could, be a little high off of it and think, man, that was awesome. But, it's not going to enter into my conversation with other people. It's not going to, unless I'm kind of a bit of an oddball that I've got to tell everybody about this video game that I played or something like that, right?
Yeah, you don't want to be that guy.
Yeah, you don't want to go there. So it's like, so maybe that would be a chance. It feels intense. And music can do this, and movies can do this to it. It feels intense, but you're right. If it doesn't kind of seep into your regular life, maybe that's an indication that I can look back and say, well, maybe that's not the spiritual experience that I thought it was.
Right. Yeah, maybe it was just a fun experience. Maybe it wasn't the transfiguration,
Right, yeah. Maybe it was just something novel. Yeah, that's right.
There's another aspect of this that I heard actually upon returning, and I thought it was a cool idea. I think you and I have both been listening to this Exodus series led by some really great thinkers, Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Os Guinness. So I'm going to give them credit for this insight, but I immediately thought of us talking about the descent so they're talking about, Egypt represents the tyranny, and the goal is to get to the promised land, but then in between you have the desert. they were in the desert 40 years. So there's that number that you like, right? 40.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The necessary wilderness.
The necessary wilderness.
Right.
So, and our idea might have been to, well, get through the desert as fast as possible. But
Sure.
they were pointing out that the desert is where they actually had these encounters with God, right? The desert is
Right.
where they had the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, right? They didn't have that when they got to the promised land.
Right.
And they had, Moses striking the water. And you can read, it's funny, is you can read the Exodus story and all kinds of amazing things happen out in the desert. And
Right.
still they complained about it.
Yeah. The supernatural was in the wilderness.
The supernatural experiences were in the wilderness.
Right.
Yeah. And once they got back to the promised land is just their normal life, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And so I think one of the things I took away from that is the value of getting away, whether it's a retreat, whether it's a church conference somewhere or a trip to Greece like we took, is to, in a more positive sense, I guess, to go into the wilderness and have eyes open for something that you're not going to see in your everyday life. Because
Yeah.
that's where it happens, right?
Right. No, and that's one thing that's interesting about travel, and we were talking about that, is when you travel, when you leave the country, when you leave your homeland, everything is different anyway. And so your eyes are always open. It's I always tell people that one thing I love about travel is that the telephone poles are different. The cars are different.
Yeah.
The billboards don't look the same. Every tiny aspect of life looks different. And because every aspect of life looks different, your eyes are much more wide open than if you were having the same experience in your hometown, so to speak, right?
Right.
And so your eyes are open anyway. And then it's kind of no surprise that you get these aha moments, these spiritual moments when everything is so different and the language is different and the food is completely different than anything you could get back home, and the Freddos are different. And so you have this complete experience, and that is partly what opens your eyes. And that can only be done in the wilderness, or it can only be done when we get out of our own routine. So
Right.
I agree with you. That's a good point, that we can actually pull away, go on a retreat, go to the mountains, go to the cabin, that type thing, and pull away from your regular life. And that can actually generate, again, I'm not trying to say that you can manufacture a religious experience, but it can pull you out. And when you pull out of your day-to-day, your eyes are opened wider.
Right. I think that's some of the prep of doing some of those things that we talk about, is the expectation that eyes wide open, I'm going to keep an eye out for a sign from God, or not to get too weird, but, some kind of supernatural experience, some kind of spiritual experience. My eyes are going to be wide open because, honestly, driving around town in St. Petersburg, my eyes aren't wide open to the wonder of God in the world,
Right.
But, somewhere else it might be. And maybe, I think it's hard to do that just in your routines, your day-to-day life. I use the example sometimes, I get up in the morning and I have my routine of making my coffee and breakfast and books and plop on the couch and try to read for a while. And I can do that pretty much without even thinking, My eyes aren't wide open, but, going back to Greece, every breakfast we had was a different experience, right?
Right.
It was all different. How do they make that? Ooh, what's that? And so even something as simple as a breakfast, it's like,
what's this called?
Yeah, your eyes are open to the wonder, to experience something different. And I do think that's a big value. Again, if you're prepped for it, of going on a retreat, a trip like this, any kind of event that takes you out of your routine.
That's experiencing life as a child, right? Because children, that's what they do. Everything's new to them. And so when my daughter was little bitty, Mom had a line, and she said, "You brought her into this world. Now let her show it to you." And I thought, man, that's so true, because a kid, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old is on their knees and they're looking at a caterpillar in the grass. Come look at this.
Yeah,
and they're just mesmerized by it. And when you see a child interact with the world, there's something, I don't know, there's something that calls me to do that. So when the Bible and talks about like a child, that doesn't necessarily mean naive and uneducated, and it means approach the world with wonder, and keep your eyes wide open and be blown away by the leaf that fell on the ground and the things that we pass by every day.
Yeah,
and I think that's all part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you, and then I'll share. I want to ask you, like, personally, how this trip changed you. What has your descent been like? But any other big thoughts about, how do we handle the descent well and take everything we can without, like you said, without trying to capture an experience that we're just going to lose, right?
Well, I think we, it's kind of just summarize what we've talked about. You reflect on it when you can. Take those moments to remember the feelings, the emotions associated with the experience, and consider the impact on your life, and to try to work that into your regular spiritual practices. I like that idea of rituals. I'll think more about that. But yeah, try to integrate that into my regular spiritual practices, something that can take me back to that moment. And yeah, we talked about connecting with others, communicating with others, and that kind of that actually creates community that can give you the opportunity to carry the experience with you. Follow up, read. Yeah, and just stay open to growth and learning. Stay open to the idea of willingly going out into the wilderness, because you can't grow unless you're in that area. So yeah, be open to new experiences, be open to new perspectives. And sometimes that may feel like going out into the wilderness because it's the unknown. But be open to that, because that's where growth happens, and that's where you meet the supernatural, let's say.
Yeah, I like that idea of voluntarily go out into the wilderness. And of course, you may be listening to this and think, well, that's easy if you go to Greece. But, I think you and I talked about this before we left. There's always a moment before any big trip or a retreat where you think to yourself, this would be easier if I just didn't go.
Yeah, I don't have time for this.
Yeah, I remember.
A lot of work, a lot of money. I can't get away from my job. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's easier. I remember talking to a guy who wanted to take a serving trip to Guatemala with us, and he just said, "You don't understand. I don't have time. Work won't." And I just thought, well, you're missing out, because it's never easy. One of my first retreats I took to the cabin, I'm telling you, everything. The kitchen sink was thrown at me to tell me it would be easier not to go. And it was one of the best retreats I ever had,
Yeah. And you and I, every time we go somewhere, we always just look at each other and say, all right, who's going to get the call first that something's gone wrong at the house?
Yeah.
The
exactly.
pipe's broken, the dog's sick, whatever it is,
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Yeah. Willingly go out into the wilderness, even though it's difficult. And maybe another question to turn that around is to say, if it's not difficult, is it a worthwhile experience?
Did it really stretch you? Yeah.
Right. And maybe that go back to that video game experience I was trying to kind of tie together.
Yeah.
That's just a little too easy. To sit on the couch and watch an interesting movie, that's just a little bit too easy. And so therefore it's no surprise that maybe a great movie, but it doesn't ascend to the religious experience that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
They're always going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Difficulties involved.
Yeah. No, I was thinking, I don't live too far from the beach. And so to say, I'm going to go to the beach, that's probably not going to be a religious experience for me, because it's easy,
Yep, but I am 10 hours from it. So yes,
so
I would
it may
love
be
it.
for
That'd
you.
be religious for me. That's right. All right. So what was your takeaway? How did you handle the descent? What are some things that you did to bring the experience back?
Well, we've talked a little bit about just ritualizing some things. Like I love those cappuccino Freddos that we had over there. And so I think both you and I
almost every day
bought little mixers and figured out how to make them. And, I listened to that. I made a Spotify list called Grungin' in Greece, that I listen to at least once a week, probably. Take me back. Yeah. So, those are just little rituals. But so I did try to ritualize some things, tried to change some of my reading too. I think that always happens. But, I think the bigger thing that I would have to say, and I haven't quite figured it out. I haven't quite figured out how to put exact words to it. But like one of the things that has really helped me was I came home. Of course, we're trying to get Navigating an Ancient Faith, going, sharing it with other people. So I came home super focused on getting down all that I could, just in terms of writing, in terms of putting together, websites, talking about the podcast. I'm writing a book on Philippi. We'll talk about that, future episodes. But, I tried really hard to get all of that stuff down while it was fresh. But one thing I'll say that I found is that there were a couple of things that I would do to waste time, and I don't do those anymore. And I've looked back, and after work I would play a video game, just turn your brain off for 30 minutes or something like that. Yeah. And I can look back and I go, I think I've played that video game twice in the last 5 months.
Yeah.
And I can think of other just real little things, but I look back and go, yeah, I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. That's interesting because, just the whole swipe through Pinterest or, you're right. The little time wasters, I notice I don't do that as much.
Yes.
And it wasn't a conscious thing. I'd like to say that I was just resolute about that. But no, I came back and I'm just not interested in it. And so usually I take that time if I've got, you're right. Like if I've got 20 minutes, normally that would have been, let's just see what's happening on Snapchat.
Yeah.
But now it's like, I could probably get a chapter or two, of this book that I'm reading or something like that. And I'm not sure why that's the case. Because at least, like I said, in my case, it's not, that wasn't a conscious, this is what I'm going to do,
No, I don't think it was in mine either. Although I'm trying to think how I put it into words. And I guess the best way to say it right now would be that I think I came back re-energized and understanding that, whole Bible history, everything, understanding the original culture that's a passion of mine. That's what I really enjoy. And so I would say I came back refocused on what really gives me energy and passion. And I realized that I realized kind of in a roundabout way, it's not in like, this TV show or that video game or this social media thing. Like, that's what I would say. Like, it helped me connect with my passion, and I want to live more of my life there.
Wow.
Maybe that's the way to say it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So if I ask you, if you find yourself doing meaningless time wasting activities, and we all know what those are, whatever that is for you, does that mean that it's time to push yourself? It's time to plan the trip, time to make something out. I mean, is that what that means?
Well, I think there's some truth to that, especially if you're doing it out of boredom. I've one of the things I've learned is, if I'm just kind of wasting time and I'm bored, then I need to do something to refocus about what I'm passionate about,
Yeah.
And so maybe that is, a couple of warning signs of, hey, maybe it's time. Again, I like that idea. Maybe it's time to voluntarily go out into the wilderness. Maybe it's not a trip to Greece, but maybe it's a weekend away somewhere, or even your own hometown. Maybe it's time to go to a forest preserve that I haven't been to yet.
Oh yeah. Well, the kids talk about the tech. What is it? They call it tech vacations, or what's the term? It's something like that. But basically, yeah, leave the phone at home, leave the tech at home, and just go out and even if it's just as simple as dinner or something like that.
Yeah,
but
try a new restaurant, something.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, actively, intentionally leave the tech behind because we recognize that as a distraction. So yeah, I like that.
What about you? Is there anything that you would say, this is how I've handled the descent and what I've taken back?
Well, so as we're talking about it, the more we're talking about it, the more I'm thinking, well, maybe it's a little bit more unconscious than I realize. And we're trying to say, here's what we can do to hold on to the ascent, when the reality is that if it was a meaningful experience, it's going to change you anyway, right? So again, it's like unconsciously, I'm not doing the time wasting stuff.
Yeah.
I'm wanting to read about that time and that era and connecting things in history and things like that, and wanting to expand my knowledge of it. So yeah, that's all part of it. But now I'm starting to think, well, maybe it's because of the experience that causes those things, And so, yeah, I don't know.
Maybe that's a good way to wrap things up or kind of summarize it, I would say. Maybe is that it's a little bit of both. On one hand, a true spiritual ascent moment will probably change you whether you realize it or not. At the same time, there are things that we can do to make sure that we're in the moment, to make sure we're bringing the right things home, not trying to manufacture something for someone else.
Right.
And pay attention to what happened and how I can change. And it probably is, it's probably both. It's probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, I think that puts a bow on our Greece series. I'm sure we're going to continue to talk about it.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't want it to end.
Yeah, I know. But everyone else is probably like, move
the audience
on,
is probably tired of it.
Yeah.
Sure, they can move on. Yeah.
No, we will talk about other topics. But yeah, the Greece trip was an amazing experience. And I think these couple of podcasts we've been talking about have been our attempt to just try to put into words what we experienced and hope that other people can connect with that as well. But we'll be talking about other topics as well. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please subscribe. And you can check out a lot more resources on our website, navigatingandancientfaith.com. There's articles and videos and other resources on that website as well.
Yeah, and I feel like that surely in this conversation, a few questions have popped in your head. Please leave that on our website. We'll answer those. We'd like to have a conversation with you and, yeah, see where it goes.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll talk to you next episode.
See y'all.